I usually start by asking, do you have wills already? And that ends up opening up a conversation about what their goals are for their family, for their wealth. How does philanthropy fit into that? Is that something that they want to build up now?
You work with a DAF provider, which is a charity, and so you create an account with someone like CAF. Effectively, that fund is a sub-fund under our umbrella as a charity. And so when you make your donation to the DAF, that is when the money has crossed the charitable threshold. That's when you're eligible for any tax relief available on that donation. And then the money it's irrevocably gifted. It can't go back to you. So it's not like a brokerage account where you can liquidate and bring some proceeds back. It's money that's exclusively for charitable purposes. And then once the money sits in the donor advised fund, you are then an advisor to that money. So you can help decide how it can benefit charities.
Today we're discussing the case study of a UK couple starting out on their philanthropic journey. I'm joined by my two guests, Jaime McLemore from Withers and Joe Crome from CAF. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much.
Great to be here, David.
So, before we get into the case study, which I'm going to set up in a second, it'd be great to have some brief introductions from you and how you help clients on their philanthropic journey, starting with you, Joe.
Yeah, so I'm Joe Crome. I work for CAF, Charities Aid Foundation. I support clients primarily through managing donor advised funds, so helping families and individuals, particularly those with a US-UK connection, with all of their philanthropic giving. So that's giving all types of assets and making grants to all types of charities.
Thank you. And Jaime?
So I'm a private client tax partner at Withers. I'm based in the team in London, but I'm US qualified. I'm only US qualified, as I'm very quick to point out to anyone talking to me. But because I've spent my entire career practicing in London, I work primarily with Americans who are in the UK or any clients who have some kind of US connection. And a big part of my practice is advising on philanthropy and helping clients meet their philanthropic goals.
Fantastic. Great to have you with us. We're going to set up the case study now. Leah and Matt are UK based. Matt is American and soon to exit their business, realising a sizable lump sum. After years focused on their business and raising their now teenage children, they want to explore their philanthropic ambitions. They can commit £2 million per year minimum and want their giving to extend globally, involving their children and continue as a family legacy. So Joe, just coming to you, CAF have done extensive research on the role of advisors in unlocking clients with philanthropic ambitions. Can you just set the stage for us here and what you've learned in your recent research from CAF?
Yeah, so every year CAF runs some research to find out how important philanthropy is to advisors and to high net worth individuals, and also how much it's actually discussed. And there's usually good news and bad news. The good news is that 86% of high net worth individuals give to charity, and that's about £8 billion a year in the UK, which is great. The bad news is that whilst 93% of high net worth individuals say they do want to talk about their philanthropy with an advisor, the vast majority said these conversations are just not happening. And I think for us, think about Matt and Leah, we see the biggest barrier to giving money away is inertia and overwhelm and being worried that you won't be able to do it effectively, or you won't give the right asset, or you'll give to a charity that you don't trust, or all of those sorts of things can be a real issue. So for CAF, one of our big focuses is on helping advisors have those conversations with clients as early as possible, ideally thinking also about lifetime events like business sales or inheritance, that kind of thing. And we know that really does help stimulate more giving. And we know that if high net worth individuals gave 1% of all of their assets, then there would be an extra £9 billion a year for charities in the UK. So that's a nice kind of North Star for us with our work.
And so there's a key role for advisors there in getting the education and tabling these topics for clients.
Absolutely, and also signposting. You know, we're not saying that advisors have to know everything about philanthropy, but as a minimum, being able to signpost clients to the right people is a really good start.
And Jaime, how do you work with clients like this from Withers?
I think CAF's research has borne out that the vast majority of high net worth and ultra high net worth clients do care about philanthropy. A lot of that has to do with, an increased sense of responsibility, not just for their children who they don't want to be negatively impacted by too much wealth. I mean, that's a real concern that a lot of my clients have, but also a sense of responsibility for, the world more widely. And I think they have a real sense of wanting to give back. And so I think, as Joe said, the real key here is to have these conversations as early as possible, because a couple like Leah and Matt, who we see them all the time. I mean, they've been so focused on building this business. They've been so focused on, being successful in that part of their life that they probably haven't had time to really focus and fully form what they want their charitable goals to be. But that doesn't mean that we can't capture this moment to preserve some of that wealth for charity, even in the future, right? Even if they haven't really had the time to go on their philanthropic journey, as we like to call it, we can, use this time to do something really efficient with this event. And the signposting is key, signposting other advisors, signposting times in your life where you'll have opportunities to put wealth aside. That's the really important role for an advisor for Matt and Leah.
Thank you. And just looking at the US-UK tax piece, this couple are straddling two tax regimes. How can they make charitable giving tax efficient?
Yeah, so that is a really big challenge for couples in their position. Only Matt is the American, right? So one quick and cheap answer might be, well, Leah just gives all the money away. You've only got one tax system to deal with. But it's likely they built this business together. It's likely that Matt has some of the wealth himself. He needs, if he wants to do some of the giving, some of it will be coming from him. Both the US and the UK impose geographical limitations on the types of charities that can benefit from tax relief. And most donors, they don't give money away for tax purposes, but they'll give more money away if they can get tax relief on that donation. So that's what drives an increase of charitable giving. And so for someone like Matt, we need a charity that qualifies as simultaneously as a UK charity and a US charity. And that's where dual qualified charity structures come in. And they're really efficient for someone in Matt's position who's an American in the UK. They're also really efficient for UK residents who have US sources of income, which we see a lot.
So the dual qualification of structures is important. So can you just talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, very simply, it's a UK charity with its single member or single owner being a US charity. So the UK charity is fully formed, fully registered, UK charity recognized by the Charity Commission, by HMRC. It has a board of trustees. It looks like any other UK charity. But its owner is a US charity, which is fully registered with the IRS, is exempt under 501c3. We check all of those boxes. It has its own board. It has its own governance. But the secret to this is a tax selection that the UK charity makes, which allows it to be disregarded for US tax purposes only. So by doing that, when someone like Matt gives money to the UK charity, the UK says, great, UK charity, you get your gift aid, you get your share relief, whatever you're getting. But the US sees that as a donation straight into the US charity. And then the US says, okay, we'll give you your income tax deduction, which is our equivalent tax relief. And all this is doing, it's not giving Matt an additional benefit beyond anyone in the US or the UK. It's simply putting him in the same position that he would be if he was just UK resident or just US resident without this dual tax status. Because we have a US-UK income tax treaty that alleviates a lot of double tax issues for Americans in the UK. But unfortunately, it does not address charitable giving. So we need a structure like this to just put us in parity with other people.
Thanks. And Joe, how do you work with clients like this? What's the donor-advised fund offering in this space for a couple like this?
Yeah, so you obviously the dual structure enables the tax efficiency, and then you can create that as a foundation for the family, or in our case at CAF, we kind of layer a donor advised fund structure over the top of it. And so for us, the key things are making sure that the types of assets being gifted in are compatible with both the US and UK, so making sure that HMRC and the IRS guidance is being adhered to for gifts in, so gifts of cash or shares or property, that kind of thing. But then also having to kind of lay over the Venn diagram of UK and US grant-making guidance, so making sure that lots of the families we work with are very, very global and they want to send money to charities around the world. So we have to make sure that when we're sending grants to charities and we're doing our vetting and due diligence, that we're layering both US and UK guidance to make sure that every single grant, every dollar we send out is compliant in both. So that's challenging, but actually the product you achieve under the dual qualified DAF is really great for clients, and it's really attractive for them from a tax efficiency position as well.
So Joe, for those who aren't aware, could you explain what a donor advised fund, a DAF, is?
Yeah, so I see a DAF as a one-stop shop giving account. So it's a vehicle that you and your family can use to host all of your giving. It puts all of the administration and compliance and tax efficiency in one place. So if you have a client who is making lots of gifts to charities, gifting internationally, giving a range of assets, then a donor advised fund gives you the opportunity to put that all in one convenient place. And it's often an alternative to creating your own foundation. So clients that we speak to are often making that determination between having their own foundation, which they work with a lawyer to create, or working with a donor advised fund. And it's actually a really easy process to set up a donor advised fund. You work with a DAF provider, which is a charity. And so you create an account with someone like CAF. And then that becomes, effectively that fund is a sub-fund under our umbrella as a charity. And so when you make your donation to the DAF, that is when the money has crossed the charitable threshold. That's when you're eligible for any tax relief available on that donation. And then the money it's irrevocably gifted. It can't go back to you. So it's not like a brokerage account where you can liquidate and bring some proceeds back. It's money that's exclusively for charitable purposes. And then once the money sits in the donor advised fund, you are then an advisor to that money. So you can help decide how it can benefit charities. So you could ask for the funds to be invested so they can grow. It could be a very, very long-term plan for you. Or you can immediately suggest grants to charities, whether that's domestically or internationally. And the provider that you work with, in this case CAF, will do all of the due diligence, all of the vetting, all of the processing to compliantly get those funds to the charities that you're recommending. So it's a really easy place to work with. It's a nice package for your giving, and it's often most popularly used for clients who are thinking about gifting anything other than cash, because actually in the UK most charities are not set up to accept gifts of shares or property, that kind of thing. It's also really popular with clients who are looking to give overseas, which is for high net worth individuals is very common. They're very mobile and very internationally connected. So yeah, very easy, convenient, and usually lower cost vehicle as well.
Thanks. And Jamie, how do you see this DAF compare with other choices like the foundation?
I think increasingly DAFs are edging out foundations for lots of reasons, without trying to suck up to Joe too much on what he does. But they take care of the administration. They can provide privacy for donors, which foundations typically do not. They can accept interesting assets, and they can allow for family involvement. And those are usually the big things that donors are looking for. I think where foundations can still be useful are for donors who want to know that they ultimately have control over the funds. They want to sit on the board and be the ultimate decision maker. That is something that you have to give up legally when you set up a donor advised fund. I think also where clients might have sort of direct charitable activities in mind for their foundation. They want to set up a foundation that is, I think all foundations are doing something, but they want to set up a foundation that is actually carrying out direct charitable activities. I think that is probably still a compelling argument for setting up your own foundation vehicle, although Joe might tell me, actually, we can do that with the DAF, Jamie, so that will cut out that reason. But yeah, I think there are less and less reasons for families to kind of go down the private foundation route unless they have a really high appetite for administration. I mean, running a foundation should be seen as a full-time job. It's incredibly time-consuming. And, being able to hand over all of that to an expert, actually, I think is really reassuring for a lot of donors.
And Joe, I mean, if people like the label foundation, they could call their DAF a foundation, could they? If people psychologically like the idea of the word foundation?
Yep. Yeah, so people can name their DAF really whatever they want as long as it complies with our values and any copyright issues, that kind of thing. But actually what a lot of people do is they will create a website called the X Family Foundation, and they will say, maybe we are accepting invites for applications from charities, or maybe these are the sorts of things we like to support. And there might just be a footnote at the bottom that says, all of our giving is managed under our donor advised fund with CAF. And so the grant that you receive will be from Charities Aid Foundation. And that's absolutely fine. It still gives them the feeling of meeting as a group of people. So although they're not trustees of a charity, they're advisors to the DAF. They're not legally responsible or in control, but they're recommending perfectly legitimate charitable causes, which we usually can honour. So absolutely, if they want to talk about it in terms of being a foundation, that's fine. And lots of clients will come to us. As I said earlier, they will close their foundation because they're feeling like there's actually too much of a burden with the administration, the legal responsibility, and they'll move the grant-making programs into our donor advised fund. And I always like to say all of the benefits, but none of the burdens, which might be going a step too far, but it gets, I guess, to the point that the DAF makes it easier just to enjoy the really good bit, which is giving the money away without feeling legally responsible for the reporting and the accounting and all of the costs associated. And I think that, the private wealth industry has been really important to kind of maturing the understanding of DAFs, particularly in the UK, where in the US it's a huge industry. There are hundreds of billions of dollars invested under DAFs in the US. In the UK, much smaller but growing, and I think the awareness has really grown. I think partly that's because DAFs take quite a private client approach. So the DAF itself almost feels like your brokerage account or your SIP when you log in. You can see your balance, you can recommend grants, you can download forms. And we work very much as the philanthropy people around the table of advisors. So I think it has helped it feel so familiar to clients and advisors, and that's helped the growth of DAFs in the UK.
Thanks. So, Jaime, just in terms of getting assets into that structure, so you look at the whole picture, try and find a suitable vehicle that works in the scenario. They're in a pre-sale environment at the moment, so there's options on what they could contribute. How do you start looking at what kind of assets they put into this vehicle?
Yeah, I mean, cash is always straightforward, I suppose, as a donation to charity. In the UK, get gift aid, which Joe could talk to much more eloquently than I can. In the US, you get the income tax deduction, but there are different types of relief available. There is something called share relief in the UK, which actually aligns more nicely with the US income tax relief if you're in that dual tax context. And so what we would probably look at initially is whether we can get the business into a position where it would qualify for share relief in the UK for the equivalent of that in the US. There are restrictions on that, so it's not just shares of any business. But if we can get it into that position, the benefit that we have is that not only will they get, relief for the value of the shares going into a charity, they get fully relieved from the built-in capital gains that have appreciated in the value of those shares over time. And so that can be really, quite compelling.
Thank you. Joe, how would you approach that contribution into the structure, thinking about the DAF and the different assets that are available?
Yeah, so it depends partly, as Jaime was alluding to, on what type of shares the business has. So if they're listed quoted shares, really easy, and actually with the American donor funds, with our dual qualified DAF, what we see most is the most appreciated single equities like a Tesla or Nvidia or Apple or whatever it might be. That's obviously very, very typical. On this side of the spectrum with a business exit, it's possible that they're exiting before the shares are listed, and so they might be private shares. And so firstly, we'd ask someone like Jaime to figure out whether there is a tax efficiency from a deduction perspective. There isn't always, but that doesn't mean that the client wouldn't want to gift those shares. We would then need to decide whether we can accept them. So for us, for DAFs like us, we have to think about liquidity. Is there liquidity at all? If there's not, might be a risk to us. Does the business have values and objectives that align with CAF and what we do? But also, often this is a stumbling block. Does the business allow charities to be shareholders? And that actually often is an issue that we find later down the line. So there are lots of considerations, but obviously our goal was to do our best to try and realise as many assets and as much in terms of then cash proceeds as possible for charities. So it's case by case, but we do what we can.
So Joe, just moving on to the family giving strategy. So Leah and Matt want to give meaningfully. It's not just writing checks, it's involving their teenage children. It's about what Jaime was mentioning about making sure that the family are protected from this wealth and the children have the right kind of values. How do you help clients on this sort of mission effectively to create a charitable giving strategy?
Yeah, I think the first thing to always say is try not to over-engineer things too much. Try and just get started to begin with, because back to what I was saying earlier on, when you're feeling overwhelmed or you're not sure about the next step, you can often just put it down and not do anything at all. And so I always say, get started, try some things, give to some charities, see how it goes. And then we find often clients fit into kind of two buckets beyond that. So some clients come to us and they're ready to really think about their philanthropy, and maybe they've exited their business, maybe philanthropy is almost like the second career and they're really ready to go all in. And in that case, we're sitting down with them and hopefully the children as well, and we're looking at a theory of change for them, starting from the end outcome and working backwards.
More analytical sort of thing. They're looking at the metrics and have a goal like that. Is it?
Yeah, well, yeah. At the start with a theory of change, you actually start with what's the end outcome we hope for our family? What is our best impact and legacy that we could achieve? And then you work backwards and realize what kind of outputs and impacts would we need to get there. And so that can be your end goal might be about helping cure a certain illness or something really big picture, and then you have to figure out along the journey, would that be local, would that be global, would that be impact investing, or just purely giving money away? So there's lots of things you can do there, but you come out of it with hopefully a really good strategy that the family all kind of buy into and you look at the time horizon and all that kind of thing to figure out what are we trying to achieve.
Are there any trends in like what kind of causes attract attention? I mean, you tend to think of like environmental, or have you found such a broad array of people, of what people are trying to do with their mission?
I think it's hard to see one trend other than conservation environment probably is edging ahead in terms of growth. It's not the biggest cause category, but it's probably the highest growth category. And I think particularly with the younger generation, it's definitely more popular. So that's the main one that I would say is the one to watch in the next 10 years. But I think also medical research continues to be really popular. And I think the tangibility of feeling like you can work towards a particular outcome is really appealing for everyone, really.
And working with younger clients, next gen, you touched on there the environmental causes being close to their hearts. What have you learned about working with next gen clients in this kind of scenario?
Children actually do like to be involved, and I think that that's something we always say to advisors is it's not always that interesting sitting in meetings talking about the family's wealth and the preservation of wealth and the trust structures and the beneficiary that they are and all that kind of thing. That's not always the most exciting thing for them. And we always say philanthropy is a great tool, because philanthropy is usually a thing that picks their ears up and they decide, actually, this is something I could really be involved in and excited by. So we always say maybe start with bringing them into philanthropy, use a donor advised fund because they're very safe structures. There's not really very much risk because there's a provider and experts helping you with all of the giving journey there. And we find that a lot of the younger people we work with also are really interested in peer networking and kind of peer advice. So finding out what other people are doing and not necessarily working with them, but at least being aware of what's happening in that space. So we're encouraging both charities and something that we're doing ourselves is trying to do more kind of next-gen get-together and events so they can meet other people and compare notes and kind of build that peer network, which is really important. And we know from our research that the more people talk about giving, the more they end up giving because it creates this really nice effect of almost contagion.
And they're passionate about the cause. They can connect with other families and they can really feel like part of a community that's making a difference.
Yeah, and community is very important for everyone. So that's something that we're trying to encourage as much as we can, yeah.
Thanks. And Jaime, how do you see the governance and the structures that you put in place involving the next gen? What have you observed working with next gen clients in getting them involved in this sector?
I think there's, any number of ways that families can go about this. I mean, what Joe said about just having discussions, just involving them is really critical. But I've worked with families who have taken the really, I would say, informal approach of, well, everyone's home at Christmas, so after a nice dinner, we're just going to have a talk about what we're doing. And philanthropy is one of the things that they're talking about, but they're probably talking about the family wealth more generally, whether that's a business or whether it's properties or, people are starting to get married. All of those things come up and they deal with them over, a nice Christmas time dinner. We have other clients who, they book out a conference room in our office and they bring everyone into the building for a full day, and we've got a formal agenda, and we're going to go through everything, and we're going to make decisions, and at the end of this, we're going to have resolutions, and we're going to have tracked outcomes, and this is how we do things as a family, and that works really well for them, and that's, the much more formal end. But I think anything that increases communication around what will happen, what is expected, what do we think that this wealth means for our family, what is our stewardship, what is our goal ultimately, that's only going to have benefits to the family because it helps to, what you don't want to see is family wealth get depleted by internal conflict, right? If there's a plan for preserving wealth for some purpose in the future, you don't want it all going out the window because actually there's one person who really wasn't on board and was never on board and was never really told about the plan. And that's going to eat into what the family can do later on. So I think just however you can put that communication together, however you can bring the family together to have these discussions, whatever works for them is probably the right way to do it.
Thank you. And Joe, just zooming out and looking at global grant making from the UK. Lee and Matt have identified global causes. There's a lot of donors would get nervous about making donations into countries that are complex and difficult to necessarily give to for the money to reach the purpose that they're intending. What's the UK's kind of position in this as a global kind of hub for grant making?
Yeah, the UK is a really great place to base your giving from if you're thinking globally, actually. So we have lots of NGOs based here who give internationally. We have lots of donors who decide to use their kind of global grant-making presence here in the UK, partly because we don't have many restrictions on where you can send money. So there is guidance that HMRC set out and the Charity Commission also around what you need to do if you're looking to make a grant to a charity in another country. And that obviously it's the normal things like due diligence and reporting and use of the funds, that kind of thing. But there aren't many restrictions beyond that. As long as you're giving to a charitable structure, as long as you're preserving charitable purpose, you can grant to most countries. What, of course, you want to do as well in that process is layer over things like sanctions, licenses, other high-risk jurisdiction implications like anti-money laundering regimes and counter-terrorism financing, all that stuff to make sure you're being compliant. But in terms of the regulations and the structures here in the UK, it's actually really permissible for international grant making. So we have clients who do a lot of that through us.
And what about on the privacy side? I mean, you might have some quite high-profile donors, or people might be reticent if they know that they'll be identified as someone who's making substantial donations. How do you work with clients who are nervous about exposing themselves, I suppose, if you like, to people coming who are interested in the charitable pot that you've created? Yeah,
I mean, this is one of the reasons that people use donor advised funds, because you can elect to be anonymous entirely or on a grant-by-grant basis. So particularly for our high-profile clients, they might use a donor advised fund because giving is so personal to everyone and they want to give privately sometimes. And so they can grant through a donor advised fund and preserve anonymity if they wish to. Whereas with a foundation where you have your accounts published for all to see, it's not quite as easy to be private with your giving. So we can make grants to an organisation and the donor that we're making a grant on behalf of can elect for us to say who they are or not at all. And then it just looks like a grant from CAF. They can decide there's a particular purpose they want to recommend for the grant without being named themselves. So they can still have the flexibility of aiming a grant for a particular purpose without actually being named themselves, which is really attractive for some of our more high-profile clients.
Fantastic. And Jamie, on this compliance point of having UK philanthropists giving internationally, what do you see from the legal side around some of the things that Joe mentioned as some of the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that there's a lot of pitfalls in the charitable sector, and I think I've worked with a lot of clients over the years who come kind of the charitable side of things feeling like, well, I just want to do good and that should be good enough. And unfortunately, it's not in the US or the UK. I mean, these are highly regulated charitable sectors. There's a lot of requirements that are imposed on charities. And to some extent, I think fair enough, because they're, benefiting from huge tax reliefs, both on donations going in and on the income that they earn in their investments. And so, the authorities probably do have a right to make sure, really oversee them, scrutinize them even, to make sure that they're applying the funds correctly. And I think because of that, you can see people just make mistakes unwittingly. They fall afoul of something like anti-money laundering rules because the average person doesn't know about these things. I mean, particularly if you're a family running a foundation sort of on your own or with limited help, it's very easy to trip these things up. What you need are proper advisors. So whether it's, a firm like Withers who advises charities all the time, or working with a donor advised fund where really actually you get to push all of that stuff onto CAF, which is quite nice for a donor. You need to really apply rigor to your processes as a charity in the same way that you did as a business, right? You need to view this kind of through the same lens to say, we have a process, it ensures that we don't, in the same way that CAF has an incredibly rigorous process for the grants that it makes, any foundation being run needs to really import that same kind of process to what they're doing to make sure that they just don't trip up any of these compliance requirements, because the downside of doing that is that, the Charity Commission steps in and says, you're actually not fit to run this. So, this thing that you set up to be your legacy is now a bit of a black mark on you. And probably because you did something just not knowing that you shouldn't do it. I think a lot of people who sort of run into issues running foundations, they do so unwittingly. They're not sort of bad actors.
Because giving internationally, I mean, it's complex, isn't it? And, there's all sorts of issues here. And even just the instinct to do good is not kind of enough to protect you. The due diligence you need on supporting causes. I mean, that's where CAF can stand behind donors, isn't it? And make sure they're fully researched and fully aware of all these complex issues, isn't it?
Yeah, and we actually increasingly see clients either coming to us and closing their foundations and transferring to us to manage for them, or keeping a foundation but keeping it as a domestic organisation and then outsourcing all of the overseas granting to CAF, because I think in an over-regulated world it's scary actually to do that on your own, to send money to high-risk places. And so effectively you can choose a provider like CAF and outsource the risk, and we manage all of the compliance, the due diligence, the reporting, the sanctions, the AML, etc. And so for clients, that's actually really appealing these days, because they're trying to de-risk all of their lives as much as they can, and obviously lean on the expertise of someone like us. And CAF opts into being FCA registered for AML purposes to make sure that what we're doing is the absolute gold standard. And we can do that because we have an economy of scale of the size of our operations. We send money to 120 countries every year, but a small family foundation would not have that kind of expertise or size or scale within their own books. So it's definitely something we're seeing more of, yeah.
So just looking at legacy and estate planning, we don't know a huge amount about Leah and Matt and their broader plans, but how do you see will and estate planning fitting in with philanthropic goals? We know that Matt's an American, so what are some of the considerations here from the general estate planning that they might undertake? Yeah,
the great thing is that the US and the UK both have exemptions from estate tax and inheritance tax for, properly structured charitable gifts. So the UK is a bit less flexible on the types of charities that you can benefit, say in your will, but allows more flexibility in how your will is drafted, whereas the US is more flexible in the charities you can benefit, but less flexible in the way you can draft your will, which unfortunately means that Matt is in the least flexible position, and if he wants to do charitable giving under his will, he needs to work with someone to make sure that he gets it right. I mean, that is just the plight of being an American in the UK, unfortunately. I have a lot of sympathy for Matt. So, but what we want to make sure is that we are taking advantage of the US and the UK reliefs, in the same way that the dual qualified structure gave us income tax reliefs on gifts during life. Making sure that we have a properly structured will ensure that we get that estate and inheritance tax relief, when something happens to Matt and part of his estate is going to charity, because the rate in both countries is 40%. So there's a huge amount at stake, and the UK offers a further benefit if you leave, at least 10% of your estate to charity. It brings down your total UK inheritance tax rate. So there is a lot of good planning to be done if they do have, charitable goals that extend beyond their lifetime.
Thank you. And Joe, what about on bequests and DAFs? How do you fit into estate plans generally?
Yeah, so typically for someone like Matt and Leah, what they would do if they're building up a substantial investor donor advised fund, which they are by the looks of it, then normally with thinking about their estate, they would usually name the children or a family friend as a successor to the DAF. So the DAF can actually carry on beyond their lifetime, and the children, as long as everything's, the charitable purpose is being preserved and the fund is being used correctly, often the children will carry on advising the donor advised fund into the future. And Matt and Leah would often usually then name the donor advised fund to benefit from some of the assets in the estate, again, to achieve some of the inheritance tax exemptions. So that's typically how it's done. They can elect for the donor advised fund to just be distributed upon death to certain charities they name in a letter of wishes, but normally clients that are building up really substantial investor donor advised funds see this as a multi-generational vehicle. So they'll be asking their children to take control beyond their lifetime and make it work that way. What we do see at CAF also is a huge amount of very novel, weird and wonderful bequests that are left to us. Often we don't know about them until the probate is continuing, and we're left all sorts of things, whether it's properties or ranches, or we had a Victoria Cross medal a few years ago. There's all sorts of things that get left to us, which keeps things exciting. I guess the main message for advisors and clients is make sure you communicate to the charity before you write your will about the assets you're intending for them to receive, just in case they can't or don't want to, because that can make the process quite painful for your executors further down the line.
Thanks. And just for some concluding thoughts then, Jamie, just coming to you, if you were on a call with Leah and Matt next week, what are some of the things you'd ask them? What would you table with them? What are the top priorities or questions you'd have for them on that in that interaction?
I usually start by asking, do you have wills already? Because as a estate planning lawyer at heart, that's sort of where my mind goes to immediately. And that ends up opening up a conversation about what their goals are for their family, for their wealth. How does philanthropy fit into that? Is that something that they want to build up now? Is it something that they're just thinking about in terms of, bequests on death? And that's how I would take that conversation forward.
Okay, thank you. And Joe, what would you want to table with Leah and Matt in a kick-off and a conversation with them?
Yeah, so in this kind of situation, the first thing I always ask is, are you getting advice from a lawyer and from a tax advisor? Because that's always really important. To Jamie's point, the tax efficiency is never the first objective for the client, but if they optimize it, then they usually do end up giving more. So that my first question always is, what kind of advice are you getting? And then it's more thinking about, okay, have you thought about your giving plan? Have you thought about who you're giving to at the moment? How did that go? Are you giving to whoever just asks loudest, or are you giving quite intentionally? Are you giving locally, giving globally? Do you know charities here in the UK, or do you need help with that? So all those kind of questions to get them starting to think about, what does this look like for you? And then what we will do is partner with people like Jamie and accountants and other people around the client and think about making this work as effectively as possible. So it's as tax efficient as possible, the estate plan is considered, and then we can drive the philanthropy strategy as well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for talking to me today. We look forward to sharing this interview. Thanks once again for your input.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.